George VI died in his sleep at Sandringham in the early hours of February 6, 1952. He was 56 years old. His left lung had been removed the previous September, a 3-hour operation that had found the cancer already spreading to the right. For a man who had smoked heavily for 4 decades, who had lit cigarettes through the Blitz and through the abdication and through the war, and through 15 years of a reign he had never wanted, the end had been coming slowly enough that everyone around him had been quietly preparing. His valet found him in the morning. The king had gone to bed the night before in apparent good health. He had attended a shooting party on the Sandringham estate the previous day, a normal day, the kind of country day he had always preferred to palace ceremony. His elder daughter was 4,000 miles away. Elizabeth was at Treetops Hotel in Kenya, a converted hunting lodge built into the branches of a fig tree, rising above a salt lick and water hole where animals came down at night to drink. The structure had been designed so that guests could sit in the branches and watch rhinoceroses, elephants, and buffalo move through the darkness beneath them. Harold Nicholson, the diplomat and diarist, later wrote that she had been watching rhinoceroses at the pool at roughly the moment the king died. The air would have been cool. East Africa in February, before dawn. The sounds of large animals moving in the dark below. The official announcement went out from Sandringham at 10:45 that morning. The BBC broadcast it at 11:15. Private Secretary Tommy Lascelles, who had served 3 kings before this one, approached the new widow to approve the text of the statement before it went out. He described her afterward as the Queen Mother, as she would shortly be known. That phrase, shortly to be known, contains within it everything she was now being asked to accept. She had been queen consort for 16 years. She had stood in the bombed ruins of Buckingham Palace and been called the most dangerous woman in Europe by Adolf Hitler, because her popularity had undermined German propaganda. She had been called the greatest queen since Cleopatra by Harold Nicholson, the same man who was now noting that her daughter was watching animals drink at a waterhole when the crown passed between them. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had been the most publicly visible woman in Britain for 16 years. Now she was a suffix. Elizabeth descended from the tree as a princess and boarded a plane as a queen. Winston Churchill was standing on the tarmac at London Airport when she came down the steps on February 7th, 25 years old, in black, her face utterly composed, already calculating what came next. What came next was her mother. According to an account Princess Margaret later gave to royal biographer Robert Lacey, the Queen Mother had made clear in those first days after the king's death precisely where she located the meaning of the change. Now they will have to take Bertie's photograph off the mantelpiece and put up yours. That attribution runs through a single chain, Margaret's own recollection, transmitted through Lacey, and can't be corroborated by any independent source. But the sentiment it describes fits everything else that can be documented about the weeks that followed. The Queen Mother had not wanted the crown in the first place. The abdication crisis in 1936 had been, by her own account, a blow from which she believed they would never recover. And yet she had spent 16 years growing entirely into the role that crisis forced on her family, and on her. She was, by February 1952, arguably the most popular person in Britain. She had stood in the bombed-out East End and told the people there that she was glad the palace had been hit, because now she could look them in the face. She had broadcast to the nation while bombs fell. She had refused to send her children to Canada, and refused to leave her husband, and refused to show fear. Or, if she had felt it, had kept it where no one could see it. She had embodied something millions of people had needed, and she had done it with such apparent naturalness that the effort was invisible. Now that was over. She was 51 years old, and her daughter was queen. What Elizabeth grasped in those first weeks was that you couldn't fight this publicly. The arithmetic was too simple. The Queen Mother had done nothing wrong, officially. She was a widow. She was beloved. Whatever edge there was in a comment about photographs on mantelpieces, whatever unease lived beneath the impeccable public posture, Elizabeth couldn't respond to it without creating a spectacle that the institution couldn't afford. She absorbed it. She would spend the next 50 years absorbing things. Buckingham Palace is the sovereign's residence. When a new monarch accedes, the expectation is constitutionally clear. The new sovereign moves in, the widowed queen consort moves out. Queen Mary, when George V died in January 1936, had relocated to Marlborough House rather than remaining at the palace. The precedent was plain. The logic was plain. The palace belonged to the crown, and the crown now wore a different face. Elizabeth and Philip had been living at Clarence House since 1949. Princess Anne had been born there in August 1950. Charles, 3 years old in February 1952, had grown up in its rooms. It was their home, filled with their things. The young family's things. The accumulated domestic evidence of 4 years of a marriage that had managed, against considerable institutional pressure, to build something genuinely private. They would have to leave it. The Queen Mother would move in. Elizabeth would move to Buckingham Palace, that enormous, impersonal edifice with its 600 rooms, its staff of hundreds, its atmosphere of perpetual ceremony. Philip, who had been working to establish his own authority within the household before February 1952, would find that authority further complicated by the institutional reorganization now underway. The Queen Mother moved to Clarence House in May 1953. George VI died in February 1952. 14 months elapsed. Vanity Fair's History of Clarence House later noted that the Queen Mother, her exquisite art collection, and her daughter, Princess Margaret, finally moved into Clarence House in May 1953. That word, finally, is doing a great deal of editorial work. The precise reason for the delay isn't settled in the documentary record. Clarence House required refurbishment and preparation. Elizabeth and Philip had moved their family out. The Queen Mother was moving an establishment of formidable scale. Decades of possessions, a household staff, an art collection whose individual pieces were worth millions, into a building that had just been vacated by a young couple with small children. These aren't negligible logistical facts, but think about what the delay meant in practice. Elizabeth was sovereign from February 6, 1952. She couldn't occupy her official London residence freely for over a year after becoming queen. Her mother remained in Buckingham Palace. Elizabeth worked in Buckingham Palace. They were, for those 14 months, occupying the same building. The building that was constitutional's, in an arrangement that had no formal name and no public acknowledgement and no visible resolution. No letters documenting formal requests between them have emerged in the public record. No courtier accounts specify how many times the subject was raised, or what form the conversations took, or what explanations were offered for the timeline. What survives is the fact of the 14-month gap, the Wikipedia article on Clarence House, recording simply that Elizabeth moved to Buckingham Palace the following year, and the Vanity Fair editorial use of finally. Hugo Vickers spent years researching his biography of the Queen Mother. He had partial access to her correspondence. Elizabeth II granted him permission to quote from the Queen Mother's letters, and he had observed her in public and private over 4 decades. His portrait of her isn't hostile. He is, in places, admiring. And yet the voices he gathered from those who actually knew her up close tell a different story than the public image. The writer Stephen Tennant put it this way: "She looked everything that she wasn't, gentle, gullible, tenderness mingled with dispassionate serenity, Cool, well-bred, remote. Behind this veil, she schemed and vacillated, hard as nails. A friend said that Tennant wasn't an enemy. He was a member of the social world she inhabited, writing from affection and long proximity. And this is what affection looked like in the vicinity of this woman over time. Lady Colin Campbell, whose biography of the Queen Mother operates without the deference of the authorized Shawcross account, characterized her in similar terms. A woman whose sense of her own position wasn't something that accommodated correction easily. What she projected and what she managed privately were, throughout her life, at some distance from each other. The public statement, at least, was impeccable. William Shawcross, in the official biography researched with full access to the Royal Archives, recorded what the Queen Mother said in her first address as widow. "I commend to you our dear daughter. Give her your loyalty and devotion." Exactly correct. Exactly what was required. The private residue of a conversation about photographs on mantelpieces, assuming it happened in the form Margaret described, left no trace in the official record. Two women, the same extraordinary self-control, the same capacity to project one thing while managing another entirely. Elizabeth had grown up watching this technique being performed at the highest level, at close quarters, in the same household. The difference, by February 1952, was that Elizabeth now had to run the institution her mother had spent 16 years personifying. And her mother was still in the building. The Clarence House transition set the template for everything that followed. Elizabeth would wait when she had to. She wouldn't create spectacle. She wouldn't make demands that could be recorded and repeated. She would let the institution's mechanisms, slow, impersonal, absorptive, do what they did, and she would manage the gap between what should happen and what did happen, in the private space where none of it would ever be made public. That method would define the relationship for the next 50 years. The Queen Mother wasn't a woman who lived modestly. She maintained 4 residences: Clarence House in London, Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, Birkhall on the Balmoral estate in Scotland, and Castle of May on the far northern coast of Caithness, which she purchased herself in 1952, the year of the King's death, and spent decades restoring from near dereliction. 4 properties across 4 different regions of the country, each requiring staff and upkeep and the endless administrative weight of a household operating at royal scale. She kept racing stables, she collected art, she entertained continuously, and she entertained at a level of deliberate magnificence that wasn't incidental to who she was, but essential to it. The dinners, the guests, the tables set for people who expected to be fed and housed and provided for at the standard of someone who had been queen consort for 16 years. She had no inclination to revise that standard downward, and she didn't. Staff who worked in her household described the management of her spending as a continuous and largely futile occupation. The bills came in, she signed what she wished to sign. Efforts to impose any kind of systematic control on what went out were treated with the patient, pleasant, entirely unmovable resistance of a woman who had spent a lifetime ensuring that practical obstacles arranged themselves around her preferences, rather than the other way around. People who worked for her tended to find her absolutely delightful, and, as several former employees eventually put it in accounts that appeared after her death, completely exhausting. She banked with Coutts & Co., as the royal family always had. She died with a substantial overdraft. On March 31, 2002, the day after her death, The Guardian published a piece whose headline paired without apparent irony, style, opulence, and overdrafts. On April 3rd, a further Guardian piece confirmed the Coutts overdraft specifically, examining the financial structures around her estate that had contributed to the accumulation of debt. The Telegraph reported on it separately, in a piece titled, "The Bitter Row That Blighted the Queen Mother's Fortune," and added the detail that made the situation vivid. A single Monet from her art collection was thought to be worth more than £12 million. Given that, the Telegraph noted, covering the overdraft had not been all that risky. The reported figure was approximately £4 million. Different sources in the weeks following her death cited slightly different numbers, and no final accounting was made public. £4 million was the figure that circulated most consistently in the April 2002 reporting. £4 million owed to the royal bankers at Coutts, carried across however many years of spending that exceeded whatever provision had been made for it. Lady Colin Campbell, in her biography of the Queen Mother, stated the disposition plainly: Elizabeth and the other children paid. 10 days after the Queen Mother's death, on April 9, 2002, the day of the funeral itself, while the service was taking place at Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth applied to the High Court to have her mother's will sealed. The application was granted. Whatever the Queen Mother left behind, whatever the final accounting of 50 years of expenditure and estates and racing stables and art looked like in detail, it hasn't been subject to public scrutiny since that morning. The timing is worth holding for a moment. Same day as the funeral, 10 days after the death, executed while the family was performing the public rituals of grief, while 10 million people watched the Abbey service on television and the tenor bell was tolling 101 times for each year of her life. Elizabeth had arranged the legal closure before any of the public attention could turn toward the financial questions that might follow from it. She had managed the situation while her mother was alive. She continued managing it after her mother was dead. The sealing of the will was the last administrative act of a 50-year operation conducted entirely without public acknowledgement that an operation was being conducted at all. The Margaret Townsend crisis is usually narrated as a romantic tragedy constrained by institutional rules. What it actually shows, in the context of the mother-daughter dynamic, is something more specific and more structural. The first moment when the Queen Mother's sympathies and Elizabeth's institutional obligations pointed in exactly opposite directions. And Elizabeth was the one who had to enforce the outcome, while the Queen Mother was the one who had let the situation develop in the first place. Peter Townsend had been equerry to King George VI and, following the King's death, served in the Queen Mother's household at Clarence House. The relationship between Townsend and Princess Margaret had grown up in the Queen Mother's domestic space, at her tables, in her drawing rooms, during the shooting weekends at Burke Hall, in the whole fabric of daily life in a household where the Queen Mother was the presiding authority. When Townsend divorced his wife in November 1952 and proposed to Margaret in April 1953, the Queen Mother was the employer under whose roof this had been happening for years. Whether she had encouraged it, permitted it by comfortable inattention, or simply failed to see where things were heading, none of those possibilities is flattering, and none is fully documented. What is documented? She didn't stop it. And when the story broke into the press on Coronation Day, June 2, 1953, a journalist watching Margaret brush lint from Townsend's uniform and recognizing what that ease of contact meant, the damage to the institution was immediate. Townsend said his goodbye to Margaret at Clarence House. He was leaving for Brussels, where he would serve as air attaché. He walked out of the Queen Mother's house to a posting designed to put enough distance between him and Margaret that the situation might, over time, lose its charge. The Queen Mother was the mistress of the household. She was present. What was said in those final hours isn't recorded. Margaret turned 25 in August 1955. Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, she was now free to marry without Elizabeth's formal consent, but not without cost. Her royal income, her place in the working monarchy, her privileges. The government under Eden had made clear, with the particular bluntness that cabinet communications on sensitive subjects tend to carry, that Parliament wouldn't support the marriage. The Church of England's position on the remarriage of divorcees wasn't a formality it was going to waive for a princess. Margaret made her announcement on October 31st, 1955. She wouldn't marry Townsend. The statement cited the Church's teaching on the indissolubility of Christian marriage and her duty to the Commonwealth. It was released in the evening. She had written it herself. Elizabeth had not publicly commanded this outcome. The record describes a request. She had asked Margaret to think carefully, to wait, and the machinery of church, cabinet, and constitutional pressure had done the rest. Elizabeth stayed above it, officially, while everything below operated in the direction she needed it to operate. The Queen Mother's instincts had run toward her younger daughter's happiness. Her household had incubated the relationship. Her temperament was personal rather than constitutional, sentimental rather than institutional, shaped by 16 years during which being beloved had been the mechanism through which she had accomplished everything she needed to accomplish. Margaret's misery was real, and the Queen Mother felt it. Elizabeth's obligations required the institution to survive. The institution required the outcome it got. And Elizabeth had enforced it without appearing to enforce it, while her mother's sympathies ran the other way. That divergence, sentiment versus institutional survival, would keep reappearing for the next 4 decades. In 1980, Diana Spencer was 19 years old when she came seriously to the royal family's attention as a potential wife for Charles. Her background mapped directly onto the Queen Mother's world. Her maternal grandmother, Ruth Roche, Lady Fermoy, had long served as the Queen Mother's lady-in-waiting, present at Clarence House and Royal Lodge, woven into the domestic center of the Queen Mother's life. The Spencer connection to the crown ran straight through the Queen Mother's drawing room. Multiple accounts confirm the Queen Mother's enthusiasm for the match. Tina Brown, drawing on interviews conducted for her book on Diana, attributed the selection directly to her, that she had effectively picked out Diana as a suitable bride for the Prince of Wales. The Express's investigation of the engagement's origins described her as key in encouraging what it already knew to be the ill-fated marriage. Charles had serious doubts, well documented in Jonathan Dimbleby's authorized biography, but he was pressed toward decision by accumulating family expectation and the practical reality that the press had been following Diana for months, and the situation had its own momentum. He proposed in February 1981. The wedding was July 29th. The Queen Mother attended in a pale blue ensemble and was photographed looking genuinely, warmly pleased. The match made complete sense from everything she valued. Diana was young, aristocratic, English, unthreatening, and thoroughly connected to the world the Queen Mother had spent her life inhabiting. What she apparently didn't weigh heavily enough was that Lady Fermoy, the woman whose closeness to the Queen Mother was the connective tissue of the whole arrangement, had already advised Diana against it. Andrew Morton's biography of Diana, built from secret taped recordings Diana made of herself, included Lady Fermoy's account of what she had told her granddaughter, that their sense of humor and their lifestyle were different, and that she didn't think it would suit her. The woman who was understood by everyone, including the press, to have brokered the match, had quietly told the bride to decline. Diana went ahead anyway. Lady Fermoy would later testify in court against her own granddaughter. She died in 1993, estranged from Diana, and carrying whatever she had understood about the situation that she never said in public. By 1986, Charles had resumed his relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. The marriage was in private collapse while remaining publicly intact. Diana's experience of that collapse, the isolation, the eating disorder, the sense that the institution had closed around her without offering any purchase for appeal, emerged publicly through Morton's 1992 book, built from those secret tapes. The book landed like an institutional explosive device. Charles and Diana formally separated that year. The court divided in the way courts divide. Those who had grown up orbiting the Queen Mother tended toward loyalty to Charles. Diana had her own network, built of different material, operating at a different temperature. The Queen Mother's reading of the situation, according to Campbell's account, ran in the direction of treating Diana's distress as the problem. The Queen Mother's sympathy, early in the marriage, had been genuine, but when Diana's concerns mounted, when the pattern of behavior became undeniable, the response from that quarter was to dismiss what Diana raised as the imaginings of a difficult woman who didn't understand what she had married into. Elizabeth watched all of this from the center. She said almost nothing publicly. She made no visible choice between the competing factions. She let the situation develop through its own momentum, rather than through any act of visible authority, right up until the point where Diana's 1995 Panorama interview made the old framing completely untenable, and divorce became inevitable. Elizabeth removed Diana's HRH style in 1996. The Queen Mother's preferred version of events, that the institution had been well served, that Charles had been unfairly treated, that Diana was the difficulty, had been overtaken by the public's judgment of what had actually happened. Elizabeth had let her mother's position lose internally, without naming it as a loss. Diana died in Paris on August 31, 1997. The royal family was at Balmoral. They stayed. The days that followed operated on two tracks simultaneously. On the track, the public could see the flowers gathering outside the gates of Kensington Palace, then Buckingham Palace, then spreading to every royal residence in the country. The crowds growing quiet and then growing large and then growing very large indeed. The flag above Buckingham Palace flying at full height, because constitutional protocol held that the royal standard flies only when the sovereign is in residence, and is lowered only upon the sovereign's death. And Diana was neither sovereign nor dead, in a way the flag protocol covered. On the track the public couldn't see, a collective royal instinct formed over decades, holding its position. The family maintained composure. They were with the boys. They had already arranged Diana's funeral. They were handling it in the manner in which the institution had always handled these things, privately, correctly, with dignity maintained precisely by not performing grief for the cameras. That approach had worked for decades. It wasn't working in the first days of September 1997. The crowd's mood shifted from grief into something that felt increasingly like a question. A question the crowds were asking louder and louder by the day about whether anyone in authority understood what was happening outside the palace gates. The Express ran, "Show us you care," on its front page. The Express. Not a Republican newspaper, not an institution-hostile publication. The Express. And it was asking whether the Queen cared. The flag came down to half-mast on September 5th, 5 days after Diana died. The royal standard was replaced, for the first time over Buckingham Palace, with a flag lowered to half-height for someone who wasn't the sovereign. That same evening, Elizabeth delivered a live address from the palace. The words were hers, written specifically for the moment. She spoke of Diana as an exceptional and gifted human being. She said that in good times and in bad, Diana had never lost her capacity to smile. She said she was speaking from her heart as both queen and grandmother. She said there were lessons to be drawn from Diana's life. The speech was 416 words. 32 million people watched it. The following morning, the mood outside the palace gates had shifted. What the speech also was, though no one named it publicly, and Elizabeth didn't name it, was a public departure from every instinct the institution had followed for 50 years. The instinct that said, keep the distance, maintain the composure, don't be seen to be managed by public pressure. This was the instinct the Queen Mother embodied most completely. having been formed by decades of exactly this discipline, this precise calibration of private feeling and public presentation. She had done it through the Blitz. She had done it through the abdication. She had done it through the king's long illness and through his death, and through everything that followed. Elizabeth had watched this technique performed at the highest level since childhood, and she had reached a different conclusion about what the institution now required. The royal family's collective position during those 5 days, the staying at Balmoral, the maintained composure, the flag held at full height, wasn't Elizabeth's position alone. It was the position of the institution as her mother had always understood it. Elizabeth had held it for 5 days, and then she had moved. The Queen Mother attended Diana's funeral at Westminster Abbey on September 6th, dressed correctly, composed entirely. Whatever she thought of the flag decision, the speech, the 5 days of escalating public criticism, she said nothing publicly. That was the one discipline she and her daughter had genuinely shared their entire lives, the ability to hold everything behind the surface, where it couldn't be seen. Princess Margaret died on February 9th, 2002, at King Edward VII Hospital. She was 71, multiple strokes. A bathroom accident at Balmoral in 1999 had left her with burns on her feet and the partial loss of sight in one eye. Her last years had contracted severely around what her body would still allow her to do. She was Elizabeth's only sibling, the only other person alive who had been one of "we four," the phrase their father had used for the family before the abdication changed everything, before any of them had any idea what was coming. Elizabeth and Margaret had shared a childhood of quiet, extraordinary intensity. The shooting party weekends, the charades and skits and card games, the blacked-out windows of Windsor Castle during the war, the governess Crawfie, who would eventually betray them all in print, the Girl Guide troupe assembled so that the princesses could socialize with children their own age. Whatever complications existed between them in adult life, and there were complications, shaped partly by the Townsend affair and partly by the simple difficulty of being the Queen's sister for 50 years, Margaret had been the one person who had inhabited the same private world from the beginning. 4 days after Margaret's death, on February 13th, the Queen Mother slipped in her sitting room at Sandringham. She was 101 years old. She had been carrying a chest cold since Christmas. The fall was serious enough to alarm the entire family. She was flown to Windsor by helicopter the following day. Despite everything, despite the wheelchair she was now using, despite the cold, despite the fall, she insisted on attending Margaret's funeral on February 15th. She arrived in a people carrier with blacked-out windows. She had asked specifically that no photographs of her in a wheelchair be taken. She got that. She watched her younger daughter buried. The ashes of Princess Margaret, Countess of Snowdon, were placed in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor, where they would later be joined by the Queen Mother herself, and eventually by Elizabeth, and eventually by Philip. Then the Queen Mother was driven back to Royal Lodge. 49 days later, on March 30th, 2002, at 3:15 in the afternoon, the Queen Mother died peacefully in her sleep at Royal Lodge, Windsor. She was 101. Elizabeth was at her bedside. The official announcement was released that afternoon. By that evening, the first flowers had appeared outside the gates. The funeral was April 9th at Westminster Abbey. The tenor bell began tolling at 9:48 in the morning, 1 stroke for each year of her life. 101 strokes, the last of them landing in the silence of the nave before the service began. The coffin was draped in her personal standard, her crown resting on a cushion on top of it, a wreath of camellias from the gardens of Birkhall placed alongside. Around 1,700 military personnel took part in the procession. 200,000 members of the public filed past her coffin in the 3 days she lay in state at Westminster Hall. The queue stretched more than a mile along the Thames. 10 million people in the United Kingdom watched the broadcast. The cost was £5,400,000. On the same day as the funeral, Elizabeth applied to the High Court to have her mother's will sealed. The application was granted before the service ended. Whatever the final accounting of 101 years looked like, whatever was left after 4 residences and racing stables, and the art and the staff and the Coots overdraft, it would remain private. Her personal standard flew above Clarence House until it was lowered for the final time that afternoon. She had lived there for 49 years. She had made it entirely her own. 3 months after the funeral, Elizabeth celebrated her Golden Jubilee. June 2002. 50 years on the throne, 76 years old, and she marked it with a national celebration that gave her what she had always been most fluent in: appearing before enormous crowds, projecting stability, making the institution feel visible and functional and enduring. There were 2 million people on the Mall on the final day of the Jubilee weekend. The concerts, the fireworks, the carriage procession, the whole apparatus of royal spectacle operating at full scale. Those last 20 years, from 2002 until her death at Balmoral in September 2022, aren't ones you typically hear discussed in terms of their quality relative to what came before. The focus in royal coverage tends toward the dramatic years: the abdication, the war, the Townsend affair, the Charles and Diana crisis, the Diana funeral. The late reign doesn't carry the same narrative charge, but it was, in the assessment of those who studied her closely, among her most assured. She navigated Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein becoming public in 2019 with the same combination of public silence and private management she had applied to every previous difficulty. She navigated Harry and Meghan's departure from the working royal family in 2020, the Oprah interview, the public airing of institutional dysfunction, without ever losing the posture that the institution was, whatever happened, intact and continuing. She gave a speech during the pandemic lockdown in April 2020 that was watched by 23.3 million people in the United Kingdom, and she measured it perfectly. 4 minutes, offering comfort and historical perspective without drama, evoking 1940 without laboring the comparison. The technique had not changed. The technique had been established over 50 years of practice, under conditions of unusual difficulty. What had changed after 2002 was the operating environment. The Queen Mother, for 5 decades, had been a parallel gravity, not a formal authority, not a constitutional one, but a persistent and powerful one. The matriarch who had preceded Elizabeth in everything. The woman whose world had shaped the marriages of Elizabeth's children in ways that left Elizabeth managing consequences she hadn't created. The embodiment of an institutional culture that was simultaneously the culture Elizabeth had inherited and the culture Elizabeth sometimes needed to move against. Managing that presence had required continuous adjustment, continuous attention to where her mother's position was, and what the gap between that position and the institution's actual needs was going to cost. Working around rather than against, that was the method. It meant paying debts without announcing them. It meant allowing factions to lose by degrees rather than by decree. It meant enforcing institutional decisions without being seen to enforce them. It meant standing at a bedside at the end of 101 years and keeping her own counsel about what those years had contained. Stephen Tennant's phrase, recorded by Vickers, who had known her for decades, was "hard as nails, behind a veil of apparent softness." Elizabeth recognized that quality from childhood. She had studied it at closer range than anyone. The difference between them was ultimately about direction. The Queen Mother's hardness served the Queen Mother's position. Elizabeth's served the crown. The accounts that emerged after 2002, the financial reporting in The Guardian and Telegraph, the unauthorized biographies, the sources who spoke with greater candor once the constraint of her presence had lifted, tell a consistent story. The Queen Mother spent what she spent. Elizabeth and the other children settled what had to be settled. The management was complete, and it was invisible, and it lasted precisely as long as it needed to last. When the Queen Mother was buried in April 2002, Elizabeth was 76 years old. She would reign for another 20 years. Staff at Windsor noted that she stopped flinching when the phone rang. Subscribe for more stories like this.